Kaskiw, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Linda. I'd like to welcome everybody to our second go at the forages and looking at forages for this coming year. And today we have a couple speakers. Jane Thornton is going to be on, and Jane's going to be talking regarding a bale grazing project that she's been involved in. And then after that, I'm going to talk a little bit about annual crops for forages in case we're in a forage in a year where we're going to be needing extra forage. So to start with, we're going to start with Jane, and she's going to talk about the bale grazing project she's been involved in.
Hi, thank you, Lionel. Okay, I don't know if many of you know, but over about the last 3 or 4 years, we've had a bale grazing project. This is an on-farm project where we have just been monitoring what producers have been doing in their fields. And so this is just the results of what we're finding with the production and the species composition. And there are other components to this project that are looking at the soil fertility and that sort of thing. So bale grazing is a little bit of a misnomer. It's not really grazing, it's just bale feeding in an extensive way. So instead of putting the brown bale into a corral and bringing the cattle to the corral for the winter, the bales are placed out on a field, and that field could be pasture land, hayland, or even sometimes annual cropland. And so what we wanted to really look at was, what benefits were there, and also sort of in some of the environmental risks and what's happening to those nutrients, and when can you come back and bale feed on the same field. So we have about probably 14 or 15 sites around the province, and the ones that I'm reporting on here are the ones from the southwest area. So as you know, this is pretty typical of what a site looks like in the spring after bale feeding this was on a pasture. And you can see my cages out there. That I call those the grazing cages, and that's where I clip for yield. So I've placed them on a spot where a bale was located and in a place where a bale was not located, so it did not have the same amount of fertility impact. This site at Verdon is a medium soil. It's sort of a fine sandy loam. It's fairly black, and it's pretty good soil for those sandier type soils. Medium quality, I would say. So this bar chart here shows the forage production over 3 years, and I'll just explain it a little bit. You can see over here it says bale, no bale, and bale 07. That was the winter that the feed was out there. So in that portion of the field in the winter of 07-08, he bale fed in those areas. Then the same thing, he picked a different spot of a field in 08-09, the winter of 08-09, and he bale fed there. And then we have a third site with the same producer that in 09-10, he bale fed on those areas. And so this shows the years that we went out and sampled. So the 07-08, 2 summers later, we went out and did the forage production yield, and we did it in 2011 and 2012. So if we look at just where it was bale grazed in 07-08 winter, you can see that these blue bars show that where there was a bale placed, there was a step up in production. This is about 3,000 pounds of production, so it's pretty significant. If you go by each year, you will see that the forage production is not only dependent on the nutrients that are there, but also how much moisture the area receives. So in 2011, in the Verdon area, they had good moisture, and so you can see that when they had adequate moisture and the moisture wasn't limiting, they got even more production off that same area. So where the bale was, it produced 12,000 pounds of dry, and this is dry matter yield. It was all dried down, so this is dry matter yield. And where there was no bale, they barely got 5,000 pounds per acre. So, but then you can look at these green bars, and this is the production across all sites last year, 2012, and in their area, they basically really didn't get any more moisture after the end of June. And even though the sites with the better fertility did get more yield, it's not nearly as much as the other year. So this indicates that water was the limiting aspect there, because even in the newer years where they'd still have more moisture, you can see the production was only about maybe 1,000 pounds more here. So every year the forage production really does fluctuate, and it fluctuates due to how many nutrients you have there, but also how much rainfall is on that land. So production does increase. The one other year I wanted to show you here was the site where it was grazed, bale grazed in 09 of 010, and then I went out the summer of 2010 and sampled there. And you can see where there was no bale, actually had higher production than where there was a bale. And that is strictly due to this effect here of where these bales are. There is sometimes a lot of residue left depending on the quality of the feed, whether or not it was straw, how much you push the animals to clean up the bales, how much snow there falls in the area, that sort of thing all affects how well the animals can clean it up. And so what happens is, you can see here in the first year after sampling, the forage production actually went down because where that spot is, it hasn't filled in with forage again. But you can see the next year, it goes from 59 up to almost double the forage production. So by the next year, so in 2011, that site had recovered and was producing more than where the fertility was not. So now let's talk a little bit about species composition. And when we talk about species composition, we're talking about what plants live there. And the composition part means that we're looking at not just who lives there. So it's not just a tally of, you know, these species here. Okay, I see the presence or absence of quackgrass, smooth brome, dandelion, that sort of thing. It's really about how much of the stand is made up of quackgrass or how much of it's made up of smooth brome. And that's what the composition parts mean. So it's sort of like who's the community that lives there and how many in that community live there. So you can see where there was no bales, the stand was made up of about 66% quackgrass. And these were very old hay fields at one time, but they had got past their usefulness for hay fields and so were now being used as pastures. And then you can see that there's very little smooth brome. I think this 1% in here is the smooth brome that's left. There's a bunch of dandelion, and there's this Kentucky bluegrass, also known in Manitoba as June grass. So that fine grass that you often find in overgrazed pastures, it makes up a fair amount. And my first suspicion when we first started doing this is that Kentucky bluegrass with good fertility would do really well. But what we've been finding is that if you have something like quackgrass in your stand, you can see that this is right beside, this is where a bale was sitting, so this is where there was no bale, so there's no extra fertility there or disturbance. And then where the bale was, the influence of the fertility changed it to almost a 100% quackgrass stand. So what it means is quackgrass with the fertility and the disturbance is the most competitive grass there, so it starts to dominate the site. And it's very productive. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. I'm just reporting on what's actually happening there. So this was sampled in 2010, and so then I did species composition again in 2012. So again, I looked at the site, and you can see, again, it was very similar. And one thing to make note of is this is not a replicated trial. This is not scientific data. This is just observation data. So it's not scientifically or statistically significant. So there's probably not much difference between this 66% quackgrass and the 63% quackgrass. On this site now, the Kentucky bluegrass, 2 years later, had increased, or maybe it's just a slightly different spot in the field. That's one of the things about pastures is there's a lot of variability within the pasture, so unless you're sampling exactly the same spot, it's really hard to tell whether or not you're seeing a difference in management or whether or not you're just seeing a difference in the location that you do your sampling. I walk a transect across these fields and take a number of sites, and then I take an average for the forages or the species that are there. And you can see also that now we have a lot more of our other species coming in at 1%. So before they weren't really showing up. These zeros mean that they were in such small amounts that they didn't really register on the pie chart. But now they're starting, so it's a little bit weedier. And you can see now this is 4 years after the bales were fed on that site. And you can see that there's a little bit of foxtail barley coming in, and then there's a few other weedy species that are there present. If you walked across the field, you'd find them, but they're a very small amount. It's still predominantly dominated on those areas where the bales were fed by quackgrass. So this is the Glenborough site. And this is a totally different soil. This is what I call the yellow sands. You can see these sort of sand dune hills in the back here. This is very poor soil. It gets droughty very easily, and it doesn't produce very much forage, and grasshoppers come in on the area. It's just very, very poor soil. I call it the yellow sands, very poor soil. So you can see the forage production here. Again, you can see fertility really helps this site. So again, the blue bars are when I sampled in 2010, the orange bars are when I sampled in 2011, and the green bars are when I sampled in 2012. And again, you're going to see lots of variation between how much moisture they had and when it fell. So you can see there was a definite benefit to the production where the bales were in every case. Now, the Verdon site in 2011 had its highest forage production, but over in the Glenborough area, their rainfall pattern was different, and they were in a very bad drought that year, and you can see that the forage production is very poor. This probably is not statistically significant, the difference between the yield here. And what we're finding, I don't have any of the soil data reported here, but what we're finding on those really coarse sands, of course, is that the fertility is going deeper and deeper into the soil profile, the water soluble, so like nitrogen is falling away. The 08 site here, you can see that the fertility did help it become more water use efficient, so you did get better yield, almost 3 times. And here again, a little bit better, but probably and maybe not statistically significant. Then last year, in lots of areas, it was very dry, but you can see these green bars showed that for them, at least, the moisture came at the right time for them to get fairly good forage production. So they got significant yields. So adding fertility to those soils is definitely a benefit for that producer. In terms of species composition, again, this is an old field. When it was last seeded down to anything, who knows, but you can see there is a little bit of smooth brome in the site, and it is primarily dominated by Kentucky bluegrass. And then if you walk across the site, you will see some of these weeds, but they're in such small amounts they don't show up as registering. Once you put a bale on that site, again, I was surprised to see Kentucky bluegrass. I thought it would just yield more, which it does, but it does get pushed out by these species that are high growing point and really good nitrogen users. So in this instance, it didn't have any quackgrass in the original site. It had some smooth brome. And what we've been finding that is if you have quackgrass or smooth brome on the site, it will come to a much higher percentage of the stand, or come to completely dominate the stand. And also you can see here some of the weedy species are now showing up as 1%. So this ambrosia here is a type of ragweed, and it's sporadic over the place. Also other weeds are on the site. So that was, 2 years after they bale grazed out there, I sampled, and then we went and sampled 4 years after the original bale grazing. And again, I didn't redo the were no bales where I used the other data, so it was 94% Kentucky and 6% smooth brome. And now you can see 4 years after how much more diverse the stand is, or as well, perhaps, weather has affected it, the fertility has affected it, or again, there's some variation in exactly where I sample. But you can see the Kentucky bluegrass is only about a quarter of what it was before. And we have actually something in there. We have Canada bluegrass, which is actually a native bluegrass, has come to dominate a lot of the stands. Again, it's a rhizomatous species. And smooth brome is somewhere in here. I didn't find it anywhere when I walked through this stand this time. But you did find some of the other things. You did find some lamb's quarter, some more of the ragweed, and some of the other weeds did show up, flicksweed. And what is this one over here? I think this is pepperweed, and the gray is maybe lamb's quarter or ambrosia. It's hard to tell on this picture, the colors. But you can see that now we have, because of the disturbance at the site, you can get a lot of weedy species. In this case, they were around sporadically, but bale feeding on pasture or hayland really does cause quite a bit of disturbance, and these weedy species can often do quite well in a disturbed site. The last site that we are doing is a site at Rapid City. And definitely this is the site with probably the best soils. It's still not great for annual cropland because it's rolling and it's very stony, so hence it's in forage production. And this is a close-up shot of the site. This producer is the only one of the 3 producers that I worked with that had a good stand of seeded forages. So this guy had gone out on one site, which is this site, and seeded meadow brome and alfalfa. And then on the other site, we'll see he had seeded alfalfa and intermediate wheatgrass. And you can see that with the fertility, the composition is definitely changing because you're seeing a lot of the meadow brome, and where there's no bales, you're seeing a higher percentage of the alfalfa left. So forage production, just note here, we lost this site because he bale shredded over the site and added more nutrients to it, so we didn't want that to complicate things. We dropped that, the 08 site. So you can see he's a lot more consistent and not as affected by the moisture because his yields are more, not so sporadic. But again, you can see that every year having the fertility is giving you a lot more yield. So often almost double the yield, and other years not quite as double the yield. And if you go to this one, again, you'll see this first year, 2009, I went out and sampled it that summer after it was bale fed, and you can see there's actually a slight drop in the yield again, and that's showing the same as the Verdon site, that the disturbance was not allowing those plants to recuperate. The other thing I wanted to show you here is notice how even the production is here and here. This is the meadow brome and alfalfa site. And when we go over to the 09 site, it's an intermediate wheatgrass and alfalfa site. And so we're getting about the same production, but it is just a little bit different because it's different forages. So they definitely, with their better soils, have better water holding capacity. And this producer's forage yield has not swung around as much due to moisture, or perhaps they've been lucky and have been in more even moisture regime every summer. So his species composition, again, you can see this is the meadow brome and alfalfa. So when we started, he had a nice mix, a 70% meadow brome with 30% alfalfa, and really it was a fairly new stand, so it was in pretty good shape. You can see what the fertility does do to the site though. So alfalfa really doesn't do well under a high disturbance site, so when you put a bale out onto your alfalfa, it can smother it and then the animals trample it. And also there's a lot of free nitrogen there. So generally speaking, when grass is given free nitrogen, the alfalfa doesn't have a competitive advantage by having its symbiotic relationship with the rhizobium to fix nitrogen. So the grass can usually outcompete the alfalfa, but I think it's also a little bit of the disturbance that takes place at the site. So now he's changed his species composition to 95% grass and only about 4% alfalfa. That was 2 years after the bales were fed there. Now we're looking at 4 years after, and you can see the species. I'm just going to go back to this one. It's very similar again. This is probably not statistically significant. So basically he has meadow brome and a good stand of alfalfa, and it shows a little bit of Kentucky bluegrass coming in here, where we weren't really finding that before. So Kentucky bluegrass is starting to creep into the site. Again, like one of the other sites, 4 years after the bale grazing, we're seeing a lot more diversity on that site. So the stand is still 55% meadow brome, but it looks like the alfalfa's come back up. And I'm not really sure if that, again, because we haven't done this in replicated trials, et cetera, I'm not sure if this is indicating that the alfalfa has come back, or whether or not it's just the fact that I got stepped onto different sites to take my readings. But it almost looks like the alfalfa does recover. This producer does use very long rest periods, And the other thing that is now coming into the stand, you can see is a little bit of this quack grass is coming in. And then a bunch of little weedy things, including a little bit of Kentucky bluegrass. So the stand is changing. It's changed due to the high disturbance from feeding the bales on that forage. It's changed because of the wet springs and dry winters or summers that we've had. So there's a lot of things that change your species composition, not just the grazing impact, but moisture, fertility, and that sort of thing. So this is my last slide, and this is back to the Verdon side, and it's just a Verdon site. It's just a visual of what it looks like when I go out there. If you remember, 2011 was Verdon's highest forage production year out of the 3 years that I've sampled. And this is a site where the bale was fed, and you can see that the grass is right almost to the top of this cage. The cages are about 4 foot tall, and you can see that where the bale was not fed, the forage is about half the height. You can also see a difference in the color, and this is very typical. You'll see this is always a lighter, limier green, and this is always a darker, better green. So that's really all I wanted to give to you today. So if there are any questions, I'll take those now.
I don't have any questions right now, Jane.
Okay, great, thanks. I'll put it on to Lionel then. Thank you very much.
Don't look too far away, Jane. I got one question for you. Regarding the bale grazing, even if you look at this picture here, how far out were you looking to see your species composition? Because if the bale was placed by that cage, like, would you notice it moving or getting similar as you go farther out, or how was that working?
The species composition actually stays very located to where the fertility is. And what we found was the highest fertility was right underneath the bale. So if your bale was about 5 or 6 feet across, that was the highest fertility. And then with the cows standing around all the way around the bale, they spread the forage and the manure at about a 21-foot diameter circle around where the bale is. And it actually drops off like a line. Then as soon as you get to the edge of that 21 feet, right on the, you step a foot outside of that and you're into the no bale graze site basically. So you get these patches, so it'll go from being, say, Kentucky bluegrass, and then as soon as where a bale was fed, all of a sudden it's quackgrass or smooth brome or something like that. So it's very erratic. And so one of the questions that guys want to know is, like, I have this field and I'd like to bale feed in it again because it's the site that's the best for me. So, how soon can I come back? And we're on 6 years of soil sampling at this point, and we don't think it's time to come back yet. But certainly depending on how you place your bales, there is an opportunity to come drop bales in between on these non-fertility sites, because most of them have areas in the field which are quite easy to see early in the spring as to where you would go back and place new bales if you wanted to graze in the same area again.
Good, thanks, Jane. That was actually going to be my next question, as to if you could go back in and put them in, after that 21 feet, if you could go back in and put the bale in between the bales that were there previously. So great. Thanks, Jane. I'm assuming, Linda, there's still no more questions, and I'm going to move on to my presentation.
That's correct. I have no questions at this time.
Okay, well, part of my presentation is, my presentation today is going to be just talking a little bit about annual forages for winter feed. And I guess the reason we're talking about that right now is probably because I guess, huge increase in hay prices right now, and the amount of producers that we're starting to get calls from, and trying to figure out ways that they can make it through the rest of the winter here without having to pay some of those high prices, and looking at different options for feeding. So I think what we got talking about is, we could be in the same situation next year. I guess it's all going to depend on the year, but nobody's going to be going really into spring with a lot of reserve forages, and it's always nice to have a little bit of reserve. So we figured we'd talk a little bit about some of the annuals that might be available to producers to maybe reduce the amount of feed that they might have to either purchase or hope to get from their normal feeding or normal production areas. So I guess why look at annuals, and I guess one of the main reasons that we always talk about looking at annuals is because you have several different options for feeding those the product that you do grow on an annual. You know, you can do anything from silaging it, which has probably become one of the more common practices with it. But now with swap grazing and even baling it for green feed, there's still a lot of options open to you. So you know, you can adapt that field later on in the season as to how much feed you have. And I guess why are we looking at it? Well, I guess I mentioned it a little bit. It's an easy replacement for a shortage of hay or pasture. And so not just the fact that we might be short of feed this coming year. There were some producers that left cattle out on pastures for a long period of time last fall. It was dry, and some of those pastures might be a little bit behind, and being behind last year means they're probably going to be behind this year. And so we got some guys might be even short of pasture. So an annual can help you out there, but I think the biggest thing is it's an easy way to get a large amount of feed on limited acres, because usually our yields on annuals are going to be better than it would be if you have to plant a forage crop, or if you have a forage crop in your rotation right now. And not the 1- and 2-year-old stands of forages. They usually yield fairly good, and especially if they're managed. But we're kind of talking about some of the forage stands that are out there right now that have, you know, maybe that 5- to 10-year-old stands already, and producers are taking one cut off them, and maybe those just aren't producing as good as they have in the past. So the other thing is, it's you know, if you do look at an annual, you can mix it in with your current crop rotation. So it's not like you're going to be sowing something down for several years. It's only could be for a 1-year thing. So just for an emergency situation. The other thing with annuals is time and weather. Most producers that have been putting it up for silage, you know, you usually can get that done in 2 or 3 days, and you're not as dependent on the weather. Usually it's dry enough to go through the machines and drive in and off the fields. You know, you can be doing it so you don't have to worry about quality in the swamp. You can basically be going out there and working through a lot more I guess weather conditions than you can trying to put up normally. The other thing is you do get a fairly consistent product when you do go out, you know, grow an annual. Usually you're putting up the feed in a short period of time. So whenever you start, probably within 2 to 3 days, you got most of it put up. So quality is very similar. Usually you're growing it on a piece of land that was normally intended for a crop, like an annual crop that you would harvest. So a lot of that land, that field would be very similar for production, and you probably have a track record on that field. So usually you can kind of guesstimate as to what you'd be looking at for yield. And a lot of those areas have had, you know, fertilizer and weed control in the past. And when you're growing an annual, you know, again, you'll be basically treating it like an annual crop that you would grow for grain, but you're just going to be looking at a different harvesting method. Mentioned a bit about the quality of feed. You usually, if you're putting it up for silage, whether it be round bale silage in a pit, or, you know, even green feed, depending on how you put it up, you usually get, you know, less losses during your harvest. So you get more nutrients per acre. Usually the feed, if it's put up in a short period of time, it's fairly palatable, so you do get a very good quality feed. Well, we've noticed in the past that you're going to get usually high TDN, you know, which is equal to, you know, let's say a good alfalfa, but our protein levels on a lot of those crops is usually lower. And again, if you're looking at silage, one of the things to watch should be your calcium levels. They're usually lower. Again, you know, if you're going to be putting up a different feed that you're not used to feeding, feed sampling and feed testing is something that you should be looking at, because it's something that's going to be different for your operation. So what are some of the crops that guys have been, I guess, looking at in the past? And I'm going to mention quite a few here. We've gone through a lot of some of these, and some of them were very popular and have kind of gone by the wayside. Some of them still remain very popular, but probably two of the cereal crops that still are growing a fair bit are oats and barley. And I guess depending on where you are, oats, most varieties are fairly good. You know, barley, there is some newer varieties besides Ranger, but you know, there's other varieties that are being grown now. Corn, we have many varieties of corn that are being looked at for silage or even grazing. Millet, we have our kind of our standards, our golden German and our frozen millet. Sorghum was fairly popular a few years ago. It's kind of gone a bit by the wayside. Peas, a lot of times dairy producers are throwing peas into their barley or oats just to increase the protein level and make a little bit better feed. Triticale, again, another one that's been used a fair bit in some areas. And then you get blends of the above, and I kind of talked about that. And right at the very end here, I mentioned fall rye and winter wheat. And we've been getting some producers that are doing some interesting things with fall rye and winter wheat, and I'll talk a little bit about them as I go on through the presentation. So I'm going to break down each of them and maybe just talk a few points about each of them. But oats is usually the preferred annual. I know you usually get most of my calls about guys putting up green feed oats, and oats really has the potential to give you a fairly high yield, whether it be for green feed or whether it be for silage. Grows a lot taller than barleys can do. If you get the right kind of weather conditions, you can get a fairly good crop of oats. Harvest, I usually tell guys that, you know, harvesting it in the dough stage is best for the forage quality. Those seeds will stay in your sample, in the bale or in the silage pile, and they'll be doughy stage when you're going to feed it. Oats is not as drought tolerant as barley, so that's one thing we need to be watching for. We can get rust in oats, so maybe something you might need to pencil in if you're going to be looking at growing it for feed is there might be an application of a fungicide. And also, if you have it in a rotation, and volunteer oats is going to be a lot easier to control in next year's crop than some of the other crops. Especially if you grow a lot of wheat, you know, you got to remember if you're going to be putting it up for feed, there is going to be shattering, and some of those oats are going to remain viable on the ground. Barley, barley's been really good for silage, and probably because it's we've had some varieties that have really increased our yields, and so we've got quite a few people that are looking at growing barley for silage. It's a really good high energy feed. Forage quality probably a little bit lower than oats, and sometimes with oats, if you cut it at the right time, it tends to regrow a little bit. But we've noticed that, and if it does regrow, you can get some fall grazing. But in barley, usually once you go and take that cut, you're done. Barley would be definitely harder to control volunteers than wheat, so that's one thing you definitely need to be watching for because it can be a downgrading factor in upcoming years in your wheat crop. Corn, probably the one that has taken over the large majority of acres over the past couple of years. You get a good yield on corn. You can produce a large amount of feed. Normally, corn is fairly high in TDN, lower in protein than we want, and in some cases than you would need, depending on the animal you're feeding it to, and if it's cattle, depending on what stage of pregnancy they are, you may need to be supplementing if you're going to be feeding just a corn silage. The other thing with corn silage is it can be very expensive to grow, so getting a low yield in corn silage is definitely not a very good option. So I guess experience in growing it is probably one of the key things I'd like to give you on that one. Millet. Millet is popular in a lot of lighter soils, and when seeding gets to be a little bit later in the spring. We get a wet spring and producers can't get out there to get the crop in, then millet is definitely an option. Can be sown in late, early to late June and right through to the beginning of July. So there's definitely a lot of advantages there. If you get a good crop of millet, I've seen guys pulling off 5-6 ton an acre of millet, of really good, very good quality feed. Sometimes, depending on how you put it up, it can be a little bit difficult to get dry if you want to bale it. If you want to silage it, not a problem. And again, the thing with millet is one of the biggest concerns getting it established. It's when it starts off in the spring, it doesn't like to be sown deep. You need to get it going, and it's not very weed competitive. So that's something that you need to be watching for. And I guess the advantage of sowing it later in June is maybe you can get some weed control then. The sorghums, it has the ability to yield, almost equal to what corn can yield. Its TD and protein levels can be equal to barley. So again, you've got a very good feed. It will regrow after the first cut. The biggest thing with sorghum that we've seen throughout the Southwest here is the difficulty in getting it established. It is a very finicky seed. It doesn't like being sown deep. It definitely needs moisture to get going. The ground needs to be warm, so you need to almost treat the ground like you were going to be growing corn. And when it is small, it is not very competitive, and it will just sit there if the weeds are growing fast, and you'll not get a very good stand. So weed control is also very important. So again, a crop that can yield good, but a crop that does require a lot more management than some of the other crops. And there's just a picture of Mega Green, which was a sorghum that was grown in some of the areas, and it can give you a lot of material. One of the other things about the sorghums is you pretty much need to silage it. I had a few producers that tried to bale it and go in with the hay vine, but if you get a good heavy crop, it's just never going to dry down for you good enough to be able to put in the bale. So gone through a bit of a few of the crops. I'm going to touch on a few more later on, but a little bit about the management. And I guess one of the things with looking at sowing an annual, you don't need to be going out there and buying or having to worry about specialized equipment. The equipment you seed all your other crops with right now can be used to plant your crop. Maybe with the exception of corn, because of the expense of growing corn, I see a lot of producers that are going to a corn planter, and now some of the dealers that are selling you the seed have planters now, so that's one good option for you if you're going to do it. And there are some custom guys out there now that are going around planting too. So again, you don't have to go buy the equipment, you just maybe be an extra cost on some of the custom work. Seeding rates, usually when we're talking seeding rates for forage, we're talking at the higher end of the rate. So if you're looking at barley, you're probably looking at 2 bushel barley. If you're looking at oats, you're looking at almost up to the 3 bushels of oats an acre, that kind of thing. You want to be at the high end because you want to produce as much forage out there as you can. Because you're planting a lot of seed, fertilizer rates, you usually, again, we're looking at the higher end of the rates because, again, you want to create as much material out there as you can. I guess just a little note on that, I guess it's going to depend a little bit on what time of year you're planting it. If you end up going out in late June already, we need to start looking at maybe cutting back our fertilizer rates a little bit because we don't want this thing going on right through to fall before it's ready to harvest or to put up the seed and start worrying about the fall frost. Weed control. Grassy herbicide seldom used. If you're growing corn, it's probably a Roundup tolerant one anyway, so you don't need to worry about that. But if you're growing the barleys or the oats or the triticales, basically just a broad weed control is what guys are looking at. And there's not a lot on some of the millets and some of the Sudan grasses, there's not a lot of products that are registered, but there has been some work done. And if you're looking at sowing some of those crops, if you go into your local GO office, you may be able to find out some of that information because WADO or the Westman Ag Diversification Organization has done some work regarding some of the chemicals that might work on some of these annuals. I'm going to talk a little bit about costs and the increased input costs when you're growing some silage crops. Example, corn. So if you're going to grow corn, you're definitely increasing your cost. Okay, and you may need to buy some additional equipment if you're going to go, be feeding, say, silage for the first time. So those are a couple things you need to be, aware of. Your major costs are still going to be your seed, fertilizer, and chemical, and the custom work if you need some done. But feeding-wise, some of the specialized equipment, you can get away with a bucket and some reverse tires to feed cattle with. Clean ground can be done too. Get some, areas where you could feed cattle out on the ground and they'll clean it up. So, you could get away with minimal cost there, but I guess if you're going to be looking at an annual as going to be replacing some of your feed costs in the long run, then maybe some of the equipment might not be a bad investment. I went to our cost of production and I pulled out a few of the costs, our operating cost per acre for some of the crops that you would maybe look at growing, and I've got barley in here at about $170 an acre, oats at 148, corn at 300, fall rye at 125, and winter wheat at 175. Those are what basically covering your cost of putting it in and taking the crop off. Okay, their taxes and all your other fixed costs are going to be there, whether you grow a cereal crop on there for marketing through the elevator system, or if you're going to feed it. So those costs are going to be, these are the strict operating costs. So when you look at that and then you look at some of the prices right now, and if you look at alfalfa hay right now selling anywhere between 4 and 6 cents a pound, and it's going to vary depending on where you are. But if you take an average price of 5 cents a pound on a 1,600 pound bale, you're looking at a bale of alfalfa being worth about $80 a bale. Well, if you look at growing an annual like green feed for, say, for silage, just depending on what crop you're going to grow, you could get anywhere between 5 and 10 ton per acre. And these would be, say, kind of average yields. If you were going to grow, say, oats or barley as an annual, the 5 to 7 ton is a fairly good average, and 5 would probably be on the lower end. Corn, 10 ton. If you're going to grow anything less than 10 ton of corn, you better not be growing corn because it's not a paying crop. So, if I took the 5 ton an acre yield of, say, oats, and that would equal about 6 bales an acre. If you were to do the numbers at 5 cents a pound, that would equal about $550 an acre. So if you had to in turn go and buy the feed at these prices they are right now, you would be needing to, basically spend, $550 an acre. And if we look back at the cost of oats or barley, we're looking at, about 150 to $170 an acre. Even if you threw in another $100 an acre for fixed cost on those acres, you're still well below what it would cost you to have to go and replace that feed. So I guess with that, I guess as an annual can definitely help out in getting you through until you either get a forage crop established or even something to look at as a long-term goal. If you're going to silage it, there's probably another $100 an acre you need to add to it for putting the crop up in custom work. So, now we're up to $300 or $350 an acre, and but we're still well ahead of having to replace that with feed. And there's just another picture of a pile. Other factors to consider when you're looking at an annual, it usually cannot be used as a complete feed, and I guess that's the, if you get a good alfalfa bale, a lot of times that could be used as your complete feed, but a lot of times if you're going to grow an annual, you're either going to need to supplement a bit of protein, or you're going to need to definitely supplement some minerals. It's not suitable to feed it for all animals. If you've got smaller calves, depending on their age, you may not be able just to feed silage, say, all your calves. You may need to be supplementing that way. So definitely make sure the feed you're using, it can be fed to whatever animal you're looking at. One of the biggest things that's probably becoming an issue in the Southwest here is looking at custom crew so you can assure that the job will get done when it needs to be getting done. And we've been seeing that with the last couple of years here. It's just as the acres get larger of annuals, we're just getting, we just don't have enough crews at the right time to get the job done. So we get either overripe annual crops like barley and oats, or you get overripe corn. And when that happens, it doesn't ensile properly, and you just don't get as good a quality feed. So a lot of times I tell guys, especially if they're looking at growing corn for the first time, I'm telling them to book their custom guy now and make sure he's there for fall. Other factors, salvaging winter wheat and fall rye. We've actually had about 4 or 5 producers that have been doing this for about 4 or 5 years now. And what they like about that is there's about 3 or 4 things that really help out. One is that your flexibility of harvesting, because usually the winter wheat and the fall rye are taken off well before any of the annuals like barley or oats are ready to silage, and definitely well before any of the corn is ready to silage. So these guys are getting their stuff done. There's lots of guys around that are able to do it. They're getting good high yields, and from the samples we're sending away, we're getting back some really good or comparable feed values to barley or oats. So definitely an option. But it also leaves you other options. You can take it up as green feed, you can swath graze it, or if it looks like you're going to have feed from other sources, you can harvest it. So it's one that definitely leaves you a lot of options open. The other thing is what some guys have been doing is they'll seed barley in the spring for silage, and then they'll go back and they'll underseed it to winter wheat. And when they take the silage off in the fall, the barley silage off in the fall, they have winter wheat and fall rye growing in the stubble, and they can come back and graze that in late September and October, and they've got a good place to bring the cattle home after pastures are starting to wind down, and they're kind of getting 2 crops off of one field. And if things work out good, if the field is close enough to home, they get some spring grazing out of that field as well. So that's been done. We've also had some guys that have actually taken off the fall rye and gone back in and sowed millet, and then we're able to actually get a hay crop up on the millet. One thing you got to remember when you start looking at double cropping like that, your inputs are going to be, you're using twice the inputs because you're always taking everything off the ground. So just remember there's going to be additional costs in that, but if you can double your production or even 1.5 times your production, it's definitely going to help you with in a situation when you're tight on feed. And I guess with that, that's the last slide I had. There's several ways to put up silage, and this is probably one of the fewest ways used now. So I guess with that, Linda, if there are any questions?
No, I don't have any questions at this time.
Okay, well, I guess if that's the case, then I think we will end the webinar for today.